This is Season 1, Episode 2 of Twins Discuss. I'm Raquel, a research scientist.
And I'm Raven, a medical professional.
Today, the twins discuss the sinking of the SS El Faro during Hurricane Joaquin. Listener discretion is advised. This podcast contains mentions of death that may not be appropriate for some listeners. This podcast was written using information from various sources. It is presented as accurately as possible, though some of what is mentioned is simply speculation. Sources can be found on our social media page at Twins Discuss Podcast. So I know that we both vividly remember this incident. It's probably the only reason that we remember Hurricane Joaquin.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, Joaquin was on a path to hit the East Coast where we both live, but it ended up turning away into the Atlantic Ocean, so it never hit, but we were watching the track very closely.
We live in a state where we always watch the hurricane track.
Yeah, and the biggest part about Joaquin, I mean, besides the fact that it was one of the largest hurricanes to hit the Bahamas at the time, was that the El Faro disappeared.
Which, once we found out what it even was terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, the loss of life alone was tragic.
Yeah. The El Faro was one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history, and one of the very few commercial maritime disasters to occur involving a cargo ship during a hurricane. Because most of the time, with the technology we have now and the way that seafarers are trained, they don't run into hurricanes.
Yeah, I mean, and also they can be rescued because technologies, they have such the advanced ability to communicate with the technology they have now. So I just want to let people know as well that I know very little about this, very little. I think of the perfect storm when I think about this, how terrifying this maritime disaster was, but I really know nothing about it. Raquel has told me a bit, but I figured this would be a good podcast because I really don't know much.
Yeah, it would be surprising for you. And I know, I mean, I have followed this extensively since it first broke in the news, and it was all over the news at the time. And then there was kind of this lull for about a month after it happened, and then it hit the news again for a particular reason, and then disappeared again. And about a year later, it hit the news for a third time. And that's when the transcripts were released from the black box, and everybody got to really finally understand at least what was going on the bridge at the time of this incident, which I'll cover a lot of it coming up.
Yeah, which I didn't even know that ships had black boxes. I thought that was an airplane thing, but it makes sense that they do. So that surprised me in the news.
Yeah, it's not newer technology, but it's black box. Finding a black box it's a miracle that they even get to recover them in the first place. And in El Faro's case, and I don't actually cover this in the story, so I can cover it now. They were not, when they initially found the vessel, they were not able to recover the black box because they couldn't find it. So you kind of knew the end of the story, but you didn't know how it happened. And when they went out for a second time and they actually did find it, and they went out a third time and recovered it, but the fact that they were even able to recover it in the first place is remarkable.
Do they not have trackers on them or something?
They do, but they don't last for but a short period of time.
That makes sense.
They're not incredibly accurate, and they're not incredibly accurate at certain depths.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, all right, well, I guess we'll get into it.
Let's get into it.
So this all happened back in 2015. Joaquin formed on September 28th as an early fall tropical storm system, and as we've said before, it was expected to hit the east coast of the United States. So we were following it closely. At the time, I was in college, and at the time, you were working.
Mm-hmm.
So, I kind of wanted to know whether or not my classes were going to get canceled, and you wanted to know whether or not you were going to have to work in a hurricane.
Let's be real. There's no not going to work for Raven.
Yep. Joaquin eventually became an intense Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour.
Wow.
Yeah. And, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, that is only 2 miles per hour less than a Category 5, which is as high as it goes for now. Yeah.
That's terrifying.
It is. There are talks of extending the scale to include Category 6 and that much fictionalized Category 7. But, that's a discussion for another day.
What is the point?
I mean,
I think anything 155 and above is that.
I know.
We get
need
the
to
point.
leave.
Yeah, we get the point. That's unsurvivable. We're good.
Yeah, you need to leave. But, we like to quantify. So, they are actually looking at adding a Category 6.
Sure.
Yeah, I know. And if you watch movies like 2012, you'll see the Category 7.
Good movie, by the way. Go ahead and drop that spot in
there. It is not a good movie. Do not listen to Raven and her taste in movies. It is not good.
I love End of the World movies, y'all.
Oh. Well, I think Day After Tomorrow was better than 2012.
San Andreas.
San Andreas was awful. We're not going to get into this. All right. At any rate, to me then, Hurricane Joaquin was basically at one time a Category 5 major hurricane. And as we said, that's just insanely strong. And I don't know about you, but for me, it's hard to comprehend the magnitude of 155 mile per hour winds without some sort of comparison, like a well-known comparison to benchmark it against. So on land, we're talking about winds that'll pull the roof off of an average wooden frame home, like a gust, then collapse every single wall in that house, and then rip the house right off the foundation, like a tornado.
Wow. No.
Yeah, the winds will tear every single tree in sight straight out of the ground from the roots. It'll have storm surge of 25 feet in height, which is a little bit over half as tall as a telephone pole.
Wow, that really puts it in perspective.
Yeah, or if you're a dinophile like me, it's half as tall as a brachiosaurus.
Yeah, I can't relate.
Yeah, you don't like dinosaurs, but
Nope.
I do. Yeah, and we humans are capable of withstanding a lot of wind force. When I was researching this episode, I found out that a human can withstand winds of over 500 miles per hour.
Before what?
Before, I'm assuming that your skin starts to become ripped off at orifices that are open, like your mouth, your ears, your eyes, before you start having tearing. So we are really pliable. But we can't stand up in winds of 155 miles per hour unsupported. So you have to have a harness on, or there's actually a study that the Jet Propulsion Lab did, I think it was in the 60s, on this particular thing because they wanted to see what type of wind forces astronauts could withstand. I could try and find it and link it on our Facebook page. But
that
anyways,
could be absolutely biologically catastrophic.
Oh, for sure. But, for 155 miles per hour blowing in your face, you get a good facelift, but you can't stand in it. And it's really not the wind themselves, as you know, that typically cause physical injury. It's the debris that the winds throw around that's fatal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So at sea, these winds cause waves to swell and exceed 85 feet in height. That's greater than 6 stories.
Wow.
In most places, it's 9 stories. Yeah.
Wow, that's unsurvivable for a human fall.
Oh, can you imagine the force that water would have coming down on you?
I was just thinking that. I'm like, that's crushing.
So these waves can toss an 800-foot long, 31,000 gross ton cargo ship around like a rubber duck in a bathtub. These are absolutely, truly unsurvivable conditions for humans.
Wow. Oh my God, it gives me chills. Continue.
Yeah, I told my husband after I did the research to write this episode up that I was going to have nightmares that night just from thinking about this ship going into the storm. And in my head, it was hard to when I was researching it, it was very clinical and I was able to, get this done. And then afterwards, it was just hard to wrap my brain around, in hindsight, knowing what happened, that this was even capable of occurring, that all the events that led up to it allowed it to happen.
It's looking at imminent death.
Yeah. And, as we go through this story, you'll find out that even part of the crew knew this. So during Joaquin's 17-day run, these exact unsurvivable conditions directly led to the deaths of 34 people, and 33 of those people were aboard the El Faro.
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, it is. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history on the El Faro because it helps connect with what ends up happening with the ship. So the El Faro was a Ponce-class vessel that was built in 1975 in Chester, Pennsylvania by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company under the 1920 Jones Act, which I will actually cover later. And that was a frustrating read for me. A truly frustrating read. I mean, the whole thing's frustrating for me to read, but the part that the Jones Act plays in this story, and then with our nautical commerce and how we transport goods in our country, it's so vestigial, and it's this remnant of a time that is unnecessary now. And you'll find out. I don't know how much you know about the Jones Act.
I've never heard of it.
Cool. Okay. Well, then I'm sure some of our listeners probably have never heard of it as well. So that's a good segue for me to have. But originally, the El Faro was called Puerto Rico and was owned by the Naviadas de Puerto Rico Steamship Company and worked along the east coast of the United States.
You said that so much better than I pronounce French.
Well, we do say a lot of Spanish words.
Ah, yes, taco. Seriously, y'all, that's about it.
Yeah, for you. Poor Raven.
Yeah, poor me. But continue.
Yep, so in 1991, she was purchased by Tote Maritime. And Tote Maritime is one of Saltchuck Resources' child businesses. I don't know if you know of Saltchuck.
What are these words coming out of your mouth?
So Saltchuck is this huge transportation and distribution company headquartered in Seattle, Washington. They're like one of the most profitable privately owned businesses in the state of Washington. They have like multiple subsidiary companies that run cargo planes, trucking services, marine services, logistics. Billions of dollars run through Saltchuck. They employ, tens of thousands of people.
Wow.
And they own Tote Maritime, which will play a huge role, obviously, in the story coming up.
Okay.
All right. So after the Puerto Rico was purchased by Tote Maritime, she was renamed Northern Lights and underwent a major conversion and was linked the 90 full feet. before she began running between Washington State and Alaska. So the Northern Lights was an appropriate name.
So if you, well, 90 feet would be comparable to what type of structure or length? So I have in my brain.
So 90 feet is basically the distance between bases at a baseball field.
Wow.
So if like, yeah, home plate to first base is 90 feet.
Wow. Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah, that's adding a lot of ship. And to me, it's phenomenal that you can do that.
I don't understand the mechanics of it at all, and I'm not very good with math and science, and this is why you're logical, and I'm not a thinker, I'm a feeler.
You are such a feeler.
I'm such a feeler, so that's why I'm in medicine. So,
yeah.
Okay, length of spaces between
baseball plates.
Gotcha.
Yep. All right. So she worked the track in between Washington and Alaska until 2003. And I'm sure you can imagine what happened in 2003. She was drafted by the Military Sealift Command as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Wait a minute. Ships can be drafted?
That is, yes, ships can be drafted.
Why not?
So we'll get into the Jones Act, but the Jones Act is also designed around this philosophy as well. So Military Sealift Command can tell any domestic ship that you get to come help with this war effort.
That makes sense.
Yep. So Northern Lights was drafted, and she actually served quite admirably, running cargo and troops between the United States and Middle East until about mid-2005. She came under attack at least once, and they say survived unscathed. I'm not entirely sure how unscathed a 30-year-old ship can be from missile attacks, but
she made it. So
she did make it.
Are you going to eventually discuss like how thick her hull was and all that stuff later on in the...
I'm actually not, because I don't know what it was.
I wonder if that has anything to do with it. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to...
No, that's a good question. I can look that up for you.
I mean, because that's one of the things that we always read about, or that we cover when we read our maritime disasters, is how thick these hulls are, to how they can withstand all these pressures. And
well, it comes from stories of Empress of Ireland, Titanic, Lusitania.
Yeah.
Many of these older ships. So it's typically something that folks are like, she's 2.5 feet thick. I don't know how thick Faro was.
You don't know she was a thick girl?
I don't know. I know she was a big girl, but I don't know how thick she was.
Fair.
Yeah. So she returned to the States in mid-2005, and Tote Maritime then transferred her to its subsidiary operator, Sea Star Lines. They made her port of registry in San Juan, Puerto Rico, because they eventually intended to have her replace her sister ship, El Moro. So this is kind of when her history starts to... It gets kind of convoluted in everything that I could find. I know that at this point she was renamed from Northern Lights to El Faro, which translates to the lighthouse. She was converted into a roll-on, roll-off, lift-on, lift-off container vessel, which is in short known as a ROCON.
I actually know what that is.
Yep. Yeah, I would hope you would, as many shipwrecks as we look at together.
Terrifying when they sink.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Terrifying anyway. Even if they haven't sunk, they're terrifying regardless.
Absolutely. Just
a
sitting
millimeter
above
in
water.
the water. I know.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Horrifying. They can be in dry dock and it's still terrifying. So is it the ship and not the water? Psychological. We'll talk about this later. So she was converted into a ROCON, which is quite unusual for a pont-style vessel, because it does affect the overall stability of the boat. But Tote had done it previously with El Faro's sister ships, El Moro and El Yunque. So it worked, I suppose, it had worked out. The history here on after, like I said, does get kind of choppy especially from 2008 to 2014. I know that she started running between the U.S. and Middle East again, and then there was a bit of time where she was out of commission for 2 years in Baltimore, but I don't really know why. I don't know if it was retrofitting. I don't know if they were just not using her. I don't know if I have no idea. I mean, I would think with the lack of shipping vessels in the United States that if you have a seaworthy vessel, that it would be running. So I don't know why she wasn't running. Yeah, but in 2014, El Faro finally replaced El Moro, which was the initial reason that she was renamed and converted in the first place, and began running cargo between Jacksonville, Florida, and San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Yeah, so here's the segue for the Jones Act, because it does play a part in the fate of El Faro, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it before we went on to El Faro's ultimate ending. So officially, it was called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, and it was introduced by Senator Wesley Jones of Washington. Hence the name that it would eventually become known under. Lots of Washington going on in this story.
I can tell.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was a coincidence. So the act, which was presented just 2 years after World War I, was touted as one way to ensure that there would always be a large enough shipbuilding capacity and enough merchant mariners available in the U.S. in times of national crisis or war. So basically, the act dealt with something called cabotage, which places restrictions on non-qualifying vessels for transporting goods within a particular country's territory. So the Jones Act originally stated in 1920, when it was passed, that only U.S.-owned, U.S.-flagged, and U.S.-staffed shipping vessels could carry cargo between U.S. ports. So, so this would in turn, or was supposed to, lower shipping costs and bolster economic security by eliminating foreign shipping dependence. And in case you're curious, it didn't.
Oh, I was wondering about that, actually.
Yeah, it didn't. Some say that Senator Jones introduced this act as a roundabout way of making Alaska absolutely dependent upon Seattle-based shipping, as the senator of Washington. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if any of that's actually true, and he's not around to ask since he died in 1933. But the fact does stand out that at the time, Alaska was only a U.S. territory, and the Jones Act did, in fact, make Alaska completely and absolutely dependent upon U.S. shipping.
That's, dark.
Yeah, it sucks. Because, Alaska couldn't get trade with any other company, using illegal seafaring vessels that were not out of the United States.
Okay. Wow, that's
yeah, it's one of
dominating
the many things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the act further was amended in 1936 in Title 46 of the United States Code to include that all cabotage could only be performed by ships at least 75% U.S. owned, at least 75% U.S. crewed, but assembled entirely in the United States with all major components of the hull and superstructure fabricated domestically.
Made in the USA.
Gotta be. 100% made in the USA, even though they could be 25% owned, 25% crewed, by, and obviously flagged under the U.S., but by other countries. And, part of that was economic.
Makes sense.
Yeah, how many shipping companies are 100% owned in the United States? In 1936.
No
yeah, I don't either, but I'm assuming that somebody has some part of
some monopoly upon it.
Right. Yeah. Other countries are going to probably be involved. Another thing that it added in was that ships must also be repaired domestically, with only 10% of those repairs and refittings to the superstructure and hull allowed to be completed with foreign steel or by foreign nations.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, but we are talking about ships that go between U.S. ports. But if you do use a ship to transport in another country, that nation can only repair 10% of that ship, or you have to bring your own people in.
I was wondering about that. I was like, if they're, say, stranded, near India, if, you'd have to bring in American engineers to repair it with American, I guess, equipment and
Yep.
parts.
Yep.
Wow.
To stay legal. Yep. And actually, that's something I'll talk about later on with the El Faro. But yeah, they would have to bring in, because, only 10% could be done. So hopefully 10% of your superstructural hull ain't damaged,
Wow.
out of another country. Yeah. Now, while this meant that the Navy and the Marine Corps could have ships commissioned without having to rely on foreign nations, it also meant that defense contracts were the majority filings at shipbuilding yards. There are 7 major shipbuilding yards in the United States, and 4 of them build exclusively military vessels.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The other 3 yards do a mix of military and commercial vessels.
Also makes sense.
Right. But could you imagine the burden it placed on commercial shipping companies and ship owners of smaller vessels to know that, it's basically going to be a we'll fit you in whenever we can system for new boats?
Yeah, I can see how that would definitely be problematic.
Yeah,
Financially problematic.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, you might have the money, but you can't get your ship built, or you can't get a ship built to continue making money. I mean, and it still is, a huge issue for commercial shippers.
No wonder they refit all these ships.
Yep. It's why we had 40, 45-year-old, 50-year-old vessels in the water that were floating around with holes in them.
Yeah.
That were being repaired, on the way back and forth to places. And it's one of those things that we don't think about. So much of what we have comes from shipping. Nautical shipping, not just maritime shipping, not from planes and trains, although the trains do play a big part of it. And we really take it for granted.
Yeah, it's very underestimated.
Yeah,
it's also a much cheaper way of shipping stuff.
It's cost effective.
Yep. It is, very much so.
Much more cost effective. And the air is full of commercial vessels, planes and such for moving people. I don't know if it would be sound to also include as much cargo as we move by sea by air.
Well, you can put more weight on the sea because of buoyancy, whereas you can't put as much weight. I mean, like one of the, if not the largest cargo plane in the world is owned and ran in Ukraine. And it definitely, I don't believe, could hold the amount of weight that these shipping containers, the weight of these shipping containers to be shipped on these ships.
And I'll actually talk about, what El Faro was carrying later on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and they ended up, having these decade-old vessels run in the water because they would try and fit in, retrofitting, rebuilding, and repairing them at these same yards if they couldn't do it on their own. And so what ended up happening, and still ends up happening now, is that shipping companies would run their ships into the ground to meet the demand of their clients, often with seafarers dealing with structural and mechanical failures of their ship while they were at sea. So El Faro was 40 years old in October of 2015. Tote claimed that she was well maintained and had passed all of her regular inspections by the American Bureau of Shipping and the U.S. Coast Guard. In reality, she was widely considered to be a rust bucket with drainage issues, leaks in her hatches, and cracks in her hull that led to her being in a constant state of repair. To top it all off, and this is this is the worst to me. I mean, I know your hull leaking and all that's bad, but her boilers were riddled with mechanical issues, and they were actually due to undergo major servicing upon her return from San Juan on her last voyage, as these impending issues were so bad that the boilers would often die when she was at sea if they were pushed too hard.
Oh, I know where this is going. This is ominous.
Yeah. So in the midst of all this, when she left Jacksonville, Florida on September 29th, she was actually in the process of being reconverted back into a straight up roll-on, roll-off, or ro-ro, for an impending transfer to Seattle in 2016.
So she was still going to be on the water.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But they were taking off the lift-on, lift-off cargo container like design of her and just making her a straight-up roll-on, roll-off. And it was a lot of it was to do with the fact that cargo container ships are not as necessary on the Alaska Seattle run, but also because of the stability issues involved with the seas up there. They're more rough than they are, in the Caribbean. So she was being converted back. So on this trip, she actually had extra mechanics and welders on board from Poland that were working around the clock on modifications in preparation for this move that would ultimately never come.
Wow.
El Faro was heavily loaded when she left port. She had 391 cargo containers strapped to her deck and almost 300 trailers, cars, and trucks in her hold. She had a crew of 33 people on board, 28 Americans and 5 Poles. When she departed, it was well known to everyone on board that Tropical Storm Joaquin was already likely to strengthen into a hurricane and was potentially on track to brush by or completely intersect the El Faro's planned path.
So, I just have to add, I cannot fathom what these people were thinking, knowing that this storm that they're going to go to work in is going to become a hurricane, regardless of the strength of this hurricane. I know what it was like when I personally had signed up to work extra, not knowing that Hurricane Florence was going to come through.
That was hilarious.
And then knowing, you know,
and you were like, oh man,
I can't cancel now. I'm going to look real bad if I do this. Hey, I'm afraid to go work in a hurricane when I'd already worked in like 3 or 4. But when they told you, when we were told the magnitude of Hurricane Florence, I felt at that point that it was my duty to continue. Right. But it was still gut-wrenching to think about the fact that I had to do it in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, I was concerned about you just because you're my twin, but our parents were, I mean, they didn't sleep that night, or day, worrying about you being in it. And then it actually was that you were going to end up working in it and having to drive home in it if you got off on time, which was, to me, a heck of a lot more concerning than you actually. I mean, I was worried about you working in it, but in your POV driving home, on these back roads that we live in, because we live in a rural area, bothered me.
And then she just ended up spitting on where I work. That's all she did was she just spit. And we're like, oh, thank God.
I know. It was still bad for the rest of the state, though.
I know she tore the coast up, but she did not tear up where I work, which is a blessing because we were as prepared as we could be for it.
Of course, yeah.
But our people were not used to actually working in it. So that was, So, yes, I can't even really fathom what these people, and I'm sure they were accustomed to working in storms considering what they do.
Right. I mean, I'm sure this was not the first time that they left. Actually, it wasn't the first time that they left port with a hurricane coming at them. Earlier that month, Hurricane Erica had actually brushed by them while they were traveling between San Juan and Jacksonville. So they had, I mean, just weeks before dealt with a hurricane.
Okay.
And yeah, and so I'm sure that that played a role in the mindset of everyone on board when they, at least that had been through Erica, when they left, this time.
Yeah. And I'm sure there was a lot of hope and a lot of fear.
I'm sure. And they still, at the end of the day, had to meet their demand. They had to get their cargo to San Juan and get back. They were on a timetable.
They had to perform their duty.
That's right. And they were all trained to do that, and they understood what it was. Yeah. Yep. So from here on out, the information that we have about the ship's final 26 hours comes from various final reports constructed by the NTSB and the Coast Guard. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you comes directly from that miraculously recovered voyage data recorder, or black box, that recorded through various microphones all of the activity on the bridge.
Okay.
Yeah, good stuff. It is a riveting read. I will link it in our social media pages for people who want to read it. So in hindsight, it was assumed that the ship's captain, Michael Davidson, had full faith in the ship's weather forecast provider, which was known as Applied Weather Technology, or AWT, and AWT's weather data software, the Bon Voyage system, or BVS. And the BVS actually had a subsidy system within it called the Tropical Storm System that would update ships hourly if there was a tropical storm in their area. And for some reason that nobody will ever know, none of the crew aboard the El Faro took advantage of this. And I don't know if you know anything about communications at sea.
No.
So for a short distance off coast, you have access to things like the Weather Channel, internet, specific broadcasts. And then at a specific point, you don't have access to any of that. And the only way that you can get information back and forth is through your radio communications on the ship. And the only way that they can get weather reports was through this AWT weather service. So it's not like they could just pull up their phone and check the Weather Channel and be like, oh, dip, Joaquin is a category 4 now. They didn't have that capacity. Like, they weren't capable of doing that.
And this is 2015.
Everything.
That's crazy.
This is 2015, yeah. The only way that they knew what was going on was through this weather service system and through reports they may have gotten when they would call in via satellite phone to tote, or when they would send out their daily email to their family. I don't know if they actually were able to read email from their family. I know they were able to send it.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're kind of out on your own and completely reliant upon this weather forecast provider. So Davidson, the only information that he would have had was from this, and he was still expected to plot the ship's course or change its route on this information. So I'm assuming that he thought that he had enough accurate information and time to protect his ship and crew.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, you would assume, yeah, he'd been a captain for many, many, many years. He was a well-experienced seaman. It wasn't his first voyage. It wasn't his first rodeo. Yeah. So I pause here because what Captain Davidson didn't know, and that none of us would actually find out until later on, was that even though AWT got its information directly from the National Weather Service, transcribing that information into tracking maps and broadcasting it to seafaring vessels often took about 9 to 10 hours.
No.
Yeah, so that meant that the tracking maps driving Captain Davidson's decisions would have been nearly half a day out of date. Yeah. Yeah, I know y'all can't see her face right now, but
Wow. Oh no, that's so bad.
can you imagine making your decisions with data that's half a day out of date for something that is changing hourly?
No, because
Yeah.
I mean that's where the whole being able to take that information and track it on a map and look at, the what
To
people
plot your
did.
course.
Yeah, people did back in the day. You look at the sky, you look at the way the wind's moving, where north, south, east, west is, and seeing how things move, and assuming by the information you have that's that old what it's going to do in the future. Whew.
Yeah. So AWT would later say that the underlying model data that they would provide was accurate, as this data actually showed the current storm's winds, waves, and air pressure at real time. But the projected track that it sent for Joaquin was sometimes many hours old. I mean, like up to 12 hours old. So
Yeah. It
they
makes
would
sense.
know, right? They would know that, the storm was, category 1, that, it had waves of a certain height, that the air pressure was this, but they would think that the track was going in a specific place that it wasn't.
Well, we having been through so many hurricanes in our lives,
Oh my
and
gosh.
having watched hurricane trackers, having had the posters on our walls, after
Yeah,
Fran
man.
and tracking all these hurricanes, how quickly within 30, 40, minutes to an hour, how quickly these things change. Having data that old, just by the path going west, northwest at one point, and then it curving around and going, towards the east, just how quickly like that it would change that's oh my gosh. Okay.
It's foreboding. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can look at Joaquin's, path now, like what it ended up doing and what its predicted tracks were on certain days. And it didn't do anything that it was predicted to do. And the crew would not have had any clue about this.
Yeah.
So around 5:57 a.m. on Wednesday, September 30th, a BVS report was received by the El Faro and reviewed by Captain Davidson and his first mate, Stephen Schultz. The helmsman at the time that always worked with Schultz was Frank Ham. And I think that anyone who knows any part of this story has a really soft place in their heart for Frank. He was a 49-year-old father of 5 and grandfather of 3, like hardworking, super nice dude. And he became like this pivotal voice when you read the transcript, because he was the last helmsman on the bridge.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so to further muddle things, and we'll get to Frank later, to further muddle things, due to a glitch of the software, the map that was provided at this time at 5:57 a.m. was the same one that the crew had seen 6 hours before and was built on data that was over 12 hours old.
They had no idea.
None.
In reality, they didn't know, but they had no idea.
Nope. The forecast suggested Joaquin's winds were only expected to be 46 miles per hour.
No.
Yeah, so Schultz and Davidson were likely unaware that at the time Joaquin was strengthening. Where its path was, when at 6:40 a.m. they made the choice to shift the ship's course slightly to the right at a new heading of 140 degrees. This would put them 10 miles outside of San Salvador Island and a little over 50 miles outside of Joaquin's Eye. Now, at the time, she wasn't, a category 4. She was smaller, or he.
What are hurricanes?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't want to assume, so I'll call it they for now. So outside of Joaquin's eye, but they hoped that this new path would help them avoid the worst of the storm. They didn't know that it actually ultimately sent them in a direct collision course with the worst. Yeah, so...
You had me on the edge of my seat. Keep going.
So Davidson, he was a smart guy, and he was super safety conscious. So he knew that they were going into a storm, or at least they were going to skirt one. And so he had the crew ensure that the cargo containers were secured on the deck. And at 7 a.m., this is on September 30th, third mate Jeremy Ream came to the bridge to relieve Schultz. Schultz gave him an update about the change in course, and they discussed potential escape route options for the El Faro should they actually be needed. So later in the day, Davidson came back onto the bridge, and he mentioned how El Faro had survived Hurricane Erica earlier that month, noting that the El Faro was solid. Ream said, "The ship's solid. It's just all the associated bits and pieces. The hull itself is fine. The plant, no problem. It's all the shit that shakes and breaks loose." Davidson replied, "Just got to keep the speed up so that we can get going down. And who knows, maybe this low will just stall. Stall a little bit, just enough for us to duck underneath." So at 10:35 a.m., another weather report arrived, and Ream studied it. He said to the helmsman on duty, "It's not moving away, not yet. I'll show you that whole time step forecast if you want. I mean, going that way, it's going to go that way, and we're actually on a collision course with it, nearly. So what he was saying was that they were headed straight for Joaquin. So the audio doesn't actually note if Ream did anything with this information, but his concerns were mirrored in second mate Danielle Randolph, who stood watch after Ream around 11:45 a.m. Randolph seemed to be the most foretelling of all the crew in the audio recorder transcripts. She openly conveyed her concern to the helmsman that worked alongside her, Larry Davis, on numerous occasions. At one point, she quoted Davidson saying, it's nothing," and then much more seriously said, "If it's nothing, then why the hell are we going on a different track line? I think he's just trying to play it down because he realizes we shouldn't have come this way, like he's saving face." To which Davis said, "We're getting sea swells now." And it was those swells, yeah.
No, I told you, I'm on the edge of my seat. This is, and if I remember correctly, wasn't Danielle she did rockabilly or pinup?
Oh, yeah. She was a huge
I think
fan
she's
of
the only
that.
one I know about in that she did that.
Yeah, well, I think there were only 2 women on board. And, for her to be a second mate, she was actually a graduate of Maine's Maritime Academy. 3 of the people on board El Faro were a graduate of that exact same academy.
Wow.
They were all exceptional seafarers, just phenomenal at what they did. And, as I read through this story, you'll kind of get a glimpse at how hard they tried to save the ship and how brave they were. So, let's get back to it. These swells that Davis pointed out were what eventually brought Davidson back onto the bridge again. He had just reported to Tote that the El Faro would be in San Juan by 8 a.m. on Friday, October 2nd. He noted to Randolph, "Damn, we're getting killed with this speed." And, this is where she says something that stuck with me ever since I first read this 510-page transcript all these years ago, because we know how things ended. She replied, "Oh, yeah. I think now is not a matter of speed. It's when we get there, as long as we arrive in one piece." chills.
Yeah, I know all I'm saying as you're saying this is wow, because honestly, it's just, I know what happens, and it's so tragic.
Yeah, it's hindsight because you see all of these opportunities that were missed to change the course of, of this ship and the fate of everyone on it.
Yeah.
So Randolph and Davis left the bridge as the early evening storm clouds started to roll in over the El Faro, and they both returned for a short period around 5 p.m. Just in time to receive a newly printed weather report. So Randolph studied it while Schultz and Ham went to dinner. They were the crew that had relieved them. Randolph told Davis that the way that she saw this report at 2 a.m., they were going to be right in the eye of the storm as it was moving right now. Randolph told a prediction to Schultz when he came back to the bridge after dinner, and they both knew that the El Faro was in danger, but neither, at least at this time, said anything to Davidson expressing their alarm, because they were seamen and they trusted their command. So Schultz just sent the weather report to the captain, and it was completely without Randolph's predictions.
Oh, why isn't this a movie?
I know. It's funny because when you read the transcript, as this is all starting to play out, the people on the bridge actually talk about the perfect storm. Talk about, I'm sure you were thinking about it.
Yeah, I have been the entire time. I mean, I can, of course, the movie came out and you and I watched it and we're like, oh my gosh. Because most of it was speculation on what really occurred in the first place. So it's really interesting to hear it from the black box.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, they didn't have on the Andrea Gale.
Yeah.
So, other members of the crew expressed concern amongst themselves, and by 11 p.m., third mate Jeremy Ream was back on the bridge, and the latest weather reports told him that Joaquin wasn't the Category 1 storm that they thought it was. It had grown into a formidable Category 3. Ream was concerned enough to call the captain in his stateroom twice between 11:05 and 11:13 p.m. to provide alternative routes for El Faro, informing Davidson that Joaquin was, quote, advancing towards them and that they would be within 22 miles of the eye in winds of up to 120 miles per hour. So the course was changed to 150 degrees, so 150 degrees. But Joaquin followed. Second mate Randolph returned to the bridge to take over at 23:45, or because I wrote that in military, 11:45 p.m., and discussed with Ream going further south and connecting with the safer Old Bahama Channel, which was actually the route that they'd taken during Hurricane Erica earlier that year. Ream left, and Danielle Randolph remained.
So were they trying to make up time, or they were just doing whatever they thought was best?
So they actually had already altered their route twice that night. And every time you change your route, it slows you down. And so they still had to make their quota. They still needed to be in port.
By 8 o'clock Friday.
Right, which is what the time that he reported. I'm not saying that they were going to end up keeping that if they had to, bypass. One of El Faro's sister ships had actually already diverted around Joaquin. They were headed back towards Jacksonville, and they'd taken a different route. And what they were trying to do was decide whether or not this would be something they'd want to do too. It had significantly slowed. It was the El Yunque, I believe. It slowed her down. Mm-hmm. And Davidson likely assumed that they could make it to San Juan safely, keep their track, do what they were supposed to do and not be set behind schedule. Being set behind schedule when you're a shipping company, it costs money. Yeah. And you burn extra fuel And that cost you money. You burn time and that cost you money. And I'm sure that all of these things were weighing on Davidson's head when he was also making his decision. I'm not saying that he wasn't making his choices to keep his crew safe as well.
You said he was very safety conscious, so
He was super safety conscious. But he was still making risky decisions, risk versus reward. And he realized that the risk was worth the reward, thinking that, I'm sure he wasn't playing with his own life. I'm sure that he thought he'd make it.
Well, the information he was provided, he assumed was accurate information.
Right, exactly. You can only make the choices with what was given.
And of course, this is all speculation because we have no idea, but...
Exactly. He's not around to ask, and I don't speak with the dead, so...
Yeah.
At around 12:30 a.m. on October 1st, so we've rolled past midnight now, another weather report came in. Randolph was at the deck at the time, and she was dismayed when she looked at it and pulled out her charts again. She's really on top of reading these weather reports. And she told Davis that at 2 a.m. they would end up passing Rum Cay, which is an island in the Bahamas. They could turn south at this point and go for Crooked Island Passage, where they would be sheltered from the swells and avoid hurricane-force winds that Joaquin would throw at them. At this time, the swells had begun to increase and throw the ship so bad at one point that it almost knocked everyone off their feet. So Randolph was incredibly concerned that they were not in a good position. And at 1:20, El Faro was right outside of Rum Cay. Randolph called Davidson to request that they shift south into the Crooked Island Passage, explained to him why she felt that they should do this, and Davidson remained unconvinced. And when Randolph hung up the phone, because we couldn't hear what Davidson was saying on the other end, we could just, hear what she was saying in the transcript because the data recorder didn't record his side of the conversations. Mm-hmm. But she ended up saying, he said to run it, which means to stay on the path that they were on and not divert. Yeah, so you and I both understand that oftentimes the chain of command is absolute.
Absolutely.
Yep. Because it is well known, and this goes, centuries of sailors have learned this, and this is something that is ingrained into them, that to defy orders goes against the grain and it actually risks everyone's safety.
You have to assume that the people making those decisions are doing it in the best interest of you and your fellow colleagues. You
Right.
have to assume that they are doing the right things for the greater good. You have
Right.
to assume that. And that's why a lot of us function on orders.
Right. And it has in the past and will in the future get people killed.
It can be. I mean, it can be.
But it also saves many,
devastating.
many lives.
Yes, yes. But you have to assume that they have more superior training to you, and even if you have longer years, they have more training, and that they are doing the right thing for the right reasons, and not for
Right.
selfish reasons. We can't assume to know.
Right. And at the end of this, you and I will discuss more of our thoughts on that. Because, we do think very similarly to the way that Randolph does, that to make a choice to change the ship's path without the captain's consent was, dangerous to think about, but it would also ultimately end up to her being fired when she got to San Juan,
Yeah.
even though she would have made it to San Juan. And to not do it would mean that she was putting the ship and its cargo and, most importantly, its crew in mortal danger. So, for the next 40 minutes until 2 a.m., I'm sure that, all she could think about as she watched the sea beat on the El Faro was whether or not she was going to give up everything that she'd worked her ass off to get on a chance that this hurricane didn't change course and that the captain was wrong and that the El Faro would make it on a path that they were already on.
Yeah.
Or that, she could stay on that path and they might die or they might make it. Davidson had decades of experience and she wasn't captain.
And this is why you have to trust your superiors.
Yep,
and they're not always right because they're human too.
Yeah. So, in hindsight, we know that Randolph was saddled with the last real chance to save the El Faro by changing this direction that Davidson had set. But instead, she told Davis at the helm to stay the course. So things just deteriorated from here. The waves at 3 a.m. were so high and so fierce that Randolph said, "We're not going to be able to take any more of those." Davidson arrived back on the bridge at 4:10 a.m. and called the weather that he saw, quote, "every day in Alaska." And part of me kind of wonders if he was serious or if he was just trying to offset any of his concern.
I'm sure he was probably terrified at this point, but
justifiably.
Yeah, like you said, with the decades of experience that he had and whatnot. I mean, I can't assume what he was thinking, but someone saying something like that to me, I would think, okay, they are just trying to calm people, be the good captain and calm people when you actually are now starting to drown in doubt.
Yeah, well, at the sea, the captain is the ship.
Yes.
The person that is the top ranking officer is known as the ship. So he was the El Faro, and I'm sure that he wanted to maintain this confidence and this calmness so that his crew would also be calm and confident.
It's just like kids and parents. If the parents upset, the kids are going to be upset. So I can see how, living by that sense of dignity is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, but, at this point, the El Faro was actually listing to the starboard side, or the right side, as the winds began to batter her exposed port, left side. And, if you know anything about cargo ships or ships at all, this is really, really, really bad.
Really bad. I know that.
Really bad.
Really bad.
Yeah. I mean, the wind battering one long side, and for the El Faro, the entire boiler-driven power plant could fail if the ship continued to list, as it was reliant on a high oil lube pressure to function. So this was a primary concern in Davidson's mind because he told the crew to counter this listing, obviously beside the fact that you could capsize if you list too much, but he told the crew to counter this listing by pumping water from the starboard side ramp tanks of the ship into the port side ramp tanks, hoping that this would counteract this list and help steady the ship in the wind. But it didn't work. Schultz called Davidson to tell him that the engines were now starting to act up, and Davidson had no choice but to make the decision to turn this monstrous 800 long foot vessel bow first towards the wind.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's an incredible feat to try and undertake, in these gigantic swells. So most of these ships run on autopilot, and the helmsman just monitors that on track. It's much safer than manually steering the ship most of the time. However, autopilot cannot do this. So they put the ship in manual and began to turn her as she was hit by these 30-foot tall waves and 115 mile per hour winds. They were now officially in the middle of a Category 3 hurricane that was quickly developing into a Category 4. So that was at 4:10. Around 4:10. So at 5:43 a.m., things took a turn even more towards the worst. So First Mate Schultz told Davidson that one of the scuttles had blown and that the ship was taking on water in hold 3.
Now you gotta explain what a scuttle is.
Yeah, so a scuttle is a particular type of hatch on a ship, and they could be in the decks or they could be on the side. I'm sure you've heard the phrase "to scuttle a ship."
Yeah.
Basically means they open up all these hatches, allow water to sink in, and the ship itself will sink. Actually, I don't know if we're going to cover this at any point, but the Andrea Doria sank because of a scuttle issue.
Yes, it did. It did. And that's
Yeah.
how I know about. But I know that our listeners probably don't know what a scuttle is.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I was like, this is
a deck.
important. This is very important to know.
Yeah, it is. And you can call them scuttles or hatches. They call them scuttles in all the reports and stuff, and I prefer to call it a scuttle because that's what it is. We are not talking about the, what is it, the seagull from Little Mermaid? Yeah, trademark Disney. So this particular scuttle was on the starboard side of the second deck. So due to the magnitude of the storm, all attempts to seal this open scuttle had failed, and vehicles were now floating in water in the hull.
So she's listing port side, right? You said she's listing towards the port side, or she's listing to the starboard side?
She's listing starboard.
Okay, she's listing starboard. Okay, I'm with it.
She's
Port
listing
side
starboard.
exposed.
Right. Listing starboard. This scuttle is on the starboard side. So she's taking on water there too. So they can't repair it because there's too much water coming in, and there's danger of getting hit with whatever's in that hold.
Vehicles.
Yep, 300 of them. Not in that particular hold, in the whole ship. So Davidson has a choice to make here. He orders the pumps to remove the water and sends Schultz to assess the flooding. Since the damaged scuttle is on the starboard side, Davidson orders that the water be pumped from the port side back to the starboard ramp tanks. So he reverses his previous order. This would get the ship leaning in the port direction so that the scuttle could be secured. All the while trying to turn this ship bow first into these winds. This is a huge ship with only 33 people on board.
This is for lack of a better term, a titanic undertaking.
Yes, yeah. At 6:01, Scholes calls up and confirms that the scuttle has been secured and is returning to the bridge, and he gets there long enough to convey his findings about the hull before heading back down to hold 3 again to monitor the water levels. I'm not brave enough.
No. Raquel, we wouldn't even be on the ship in the first place.
I know.
We wouldn't even go near the ship.
I know.
But
I don't like pools that have gotten green.
No. No. There's a leaf in the pool. I'm not getting it.
I'm out. All right. So it is 6:01 now. Randolph ends up showing back up at the bridge at this time in her civilian clothes because she is unable to sleep. And I can't blame her. And when she gets there, she's there just in time to see the ship's RPMs begin to drop. Because right now she's full throttle, turning into this storm. So she asked Davidson if that was something that he'd ordered or if the engine room had done it, lowered the RPMs, because she was clearly concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Davidson said that he didn't order it. So the ship, that we already know the boilers have issues. 10 minutes later, the ship's power plant completely died. And the Faro was dead in the water. Schultz radioed back to Davidson that the engine room was receiving water from the ventilation ducts. The engineers were working to remove that water from the engine room and hold 3 through pumps. At 6:31 a.m., Davidson ordered everyone on the ship up by saying, "Everybody up." I don't know if this means that everyone needed to wake up or people needed to get further up in the ship on decks. Not on like deck, but I don't know exactly what that meant. And I tried to find out, but I'm not a seaman. I'm not in the Navy. So if anyone listens to this episode and they know bits and pieces about, life at sea, if you know what the term everybody up means besides waking up because it's 6:30 in the morning, leave us a comment and let me know.
Yeah, leave us a comment and let us know.
Yeah. So, because it may be an nautical phrase for, get higher up, the ship's got water and the lower bits don't be down there. So the engineers, you're laughing at the fact that I said it is lower bits, huh?
Yeah, I am.
You should cut that out because it's not funny.
It's pretty funny.
All right. So the engineers got propulsion back for about 4 minutes between 6:44 and 6:48. They ended up having about 5 RPMs.
Wow.
Yeah, which this ship could push 20. Typically, she ran around 18. So to get 5 back must have been, okay, we're getting somewhere, we're making headway.
There's some hope.
Right, but then at 6:48, they went down to 0.5. So the boilers were down again. At 6:47, the last sunrise Faro would ever gleam rose above the horizon. And it's really sad to think that many of the crew working diligently below the deck never even saw it.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, at 6:54, Davidson mentioned to someone that there was significant flooding in hold 3 because a scuttle had failed. Now, I'm not sure if this was the same scuttle or a different one, and they actually never say. They don't say who Davidson's talking to, so I'm not sure. Davidson said that he wasn't raising the general alarm to abandon ship yet, and that the engineers were working on getting the power back. At this point, Faro is listing between 15 and 18 degrees, and until that part is corrected, the boilers couldn't function. So at 7:01, Davidson called Tote Maritime's emergency number to report a maritime emergency. At 7:06, he told the operator that the ship had lost propulsion, that she had a very, very healthy port list, that there was 10 to 15 feet of spray over the deck and poor visibility, and that the weather was ferocious. He said no one was panicking. But I'm not sure. I wouldn't be panicking.
I'd be panicking. I'd be absolutely out of my mind. But yep. I'd be out of my mind even stepping on that ship in the first place. But,
right? Yeah, I know. We're not a good litmus for this.
And we will get into that. We will explain why later on.
Yeah. It was at this point that so previous to this, he had asked Randolph to write up distress signals, that in case he had to authorize releasing them. And at 7:13, he released her to send these messages. So these particular messages were received, these distress messages, were received in Norway and forwarded to the Coast Guard station in Portsmouth, Virginia, and then to Tote. At 7:14, Schultz informed the captain that the ship was taking on even more water. A fire main had been struck on deck 4 by heavy cargo and had ruptured, pouring seawater into the ship. 2 minutes later... Yeah. If they didn't have more problems. 2 minutes later, the bilge alarm started going off in hold 2A on deck 4. The list was getting worse. Cars were now completely floating in hold 3. The ship was not in good shape. Schultz, who was running all over this ship, told Davidson that the broken fire main was in high water and, quote, right below the water, dark black water. By 7:20 a.m., the water was chest deep on the second deck. At 7:27, the general alarm rang, indicating that the crew would be abandoning ship. The crew was called to mustered on the starboard side of the ship, where I'm assuming that they made it, because at 7:29, the captain officially ordered abandoned ship. Containers were in the water. The ship was heavily listing. At this point, Randolph, who was still on the bridge, asked if she could go get her life preserver and the captain told her to get one for him and one for Helmsman Ham. Not 30 seconds later, at 7:30, Davidson shouted, "The bow is down, bow is down." And at 7:31, he called Schultz, who was on the deck, and said, "Get into your rafts and throw all of your rafts into the water." Schultz must have been built of titanium. I swear he must have been built of titanium, because all he said was, "Throw the rafts into the water, Roger."
Wow.
Yeah.
I know all I say is wow, but I'm just in awe.
Yeah. At this time, there are only two people left on the bridge, Michael Davidson and helmsman Frank Ham. Now, I'm not going to read the transcript here. It's highly publicized. The last 10 minutes of this transcript are all over. You can find it yourself. But it's really painful and incredibly dramatic to read. As you can imagine, this is the last few minutes of the lives of two terrified men. And if any of you want to read this transcript, we'll link it on our Facebook page.
We'll link it. I don't want to. I can't. I'm too much of a feeler. Can't do it.
Yep. So Davidson stays with Ham, trying to help him get off the bridge. And at 7:39 a.m., the recording ends with helmsman Ham screaming. Yeah. So the El Faro would be discovered in 15,000 feet of water below the ocean on October 31st. She was upright and mostly intact. The black box was not found until April 26, 2016, and then not discovered until August 2016. None of her crew would ever be seen alive again. Only one body was ever discovered, and that body was never publicly identified. In the news, they talk about, because it was found 5 or 6 days after the sinking occurred, that it was too decomposed to even identify gender or race. And I'm assuming because these details of this body that was floating in its life-preserving suit were so graphic that the family probably didn't want the details publicly, of who it was publicly released. Yeah. So debris from the El Faro would be recovered from the ocean and along the shorelines of the Caribbean and the Gulf for months to come. Frank Ham's wife would eventually be gifted with his green helmet, inscribed with his own handwritten name on the back, because a couple had found it 2 months later after the sinking while they were walking the beach in Florida. Yeah, she keeps it beside her bed in a bag. It's actually still encrusted with the sand and seaweed that they found it with.
Wow, that's oh my gosh.
Yeah, she's become this huge force to try and change these rules of the sea where the captain makes the choices for everyone else. And with, if you have enough people that recognize that something is not right, that they should be able to say something. So, that's her name's Rochelle. That's her mission. And she actually has read the transcript, and, it brings tears to her eyes to do it. But she says that it fuels her to continue this fight. Mm-hmm. Which,
Good for her.
Yep. It's part of his legacy. So, the media, with its hindsight reasoning and myopic lens, often really does like to tear into Davidson and his culpability regarding the El Faro's fate.
No.
Yeah, I know. I know that we're not, playing a blame game here with a man that made his choices based on the protocols that he didn't write, and pressures that, he didn't put on himself that ended up costing him his own life. Some people say that.
I mean, that goes back to the whole we're human aspect of following orders. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that he did not have responsibility, but I'm also not saying that he's the only reason that this ship went down and these people died. Some people say that Davidson was cocky and overconfident, But if you look at the emails that he sent Tote regarding his navigation choices around and about Joaquin, he was very, very clearly concerned about this hurricane. And I didn't cover this, but Tote actually has to approve every navigational change and choice that's made by a ship.
Wow. So they're also, if you want to place blame, they're also to blame for
Right.
what occurred, because they had the information right there. It was much more reliable for them because it was much more current than what Davidson and the rest of the El Faro had.
Yeah, it is interesting because I didn't watch the trial for this, but Tote had to have known where the El Faro was, and they had to know what Joaquin was doing. And I don't know how long it would have taken them to relay a message, or if they were using the same weather tracking device, the same system that El Faro was using or not. But at the end of the day, you would assume that there would be protocols in place that the captain could divert his ship, make a choice, and say, look, I know it's going to take us a day and a half longer to do this, but that's a hurricane, and I'm not willing to risk your multi-million-dollar vessel and the lives of my entire crew to stay on the same track that you planned for me before this hurricane turned into what it was. Those are external pressures that were placed on him, and he made a choice based on those pressures and, other mitigating factors.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, these emails show that he was, and these emails are available to be read. They're online. But Davidson's wife, her name's Teresa, she told the NTSB during the investigation that her husband was an absolute stickler for safety and would have never, ever obeyed an unsafe order. And part of me as a wife would like to think that I know my husband's character better than anyone else. And so I would like to believe that she truly knew his character. They'd been married for a long time, better than anyone else. And what he, would have done in situations like this if he'd really had all the information available to him that he didn't.
Yeah, it's interesting because, knowing from you, if you made a decision, I would stick by it 100% because I know your character. I know how you think and you function and you feel when it comes to certain things, just like I would hope that you know what your husband would do, how they would be the same way.
Right. But, the other side of that coin is that we don't really ever know anyone.
Well,
even
under
ourselves.
under pressure, you don't even know yourself how you would act. It's like, you'd like to think in a life or death situation, you would react a certain way, but in reality, I hope you never have to know. But, having had certain experiences in my life, I like to believe I know how I would respond and how I would act because I can somewhat compare. But in actuality, it's different when it's your life or the lives of others.
And you're in it. Yep. You won't know until you're in it. And that's why I don't ever judge people on how they respond to a death or a traumatic event or something, because you cannot compare how you would respond to how other people would respond, because everybody responds differently.
We're human, and that's what a lot of people tend to forget when they play, quote, the blame game, whether it's in this situation or whether it's in a divorce or, whatever. People are human, and we cannot be held to the same standard as gods.
Absolutely. Yep. So the NTSB investigation into the sinking would eventually conclude that contributing to the sinking was ineffective bridge resource management on board El Faro, which included the captain's failure to adequately consider officer suggestions. Also contributing to the sinking was the inadequacy of both Tote's oversight and its safety management system. Further contributing factors to the loss of El Faro were flooding in cargo holds from an undetected open watertight scuttle and damaged seawater piping, loss of propulsion due to low lube oil pressure to the main engine resulting from a sustained list, and subsequent down flooding through unsecured ventilation closures to the cargo holds. Also contributing to the loss of the vessel was the lack of an approved damage control plan that would have assisted the crew in recognizing the severity of the vessel's condition and in responding to the emergency. Contributing to the loss of life was the lack of appropriate survival craft for the conditions. So, part of the debris that was found after El Faro's sinking were 2 life rafts. And these were closed fiberglass life rafts, but they were beat to, damn it, hell. They were in pieces, and they were not adequate to withstand the type of weather trauma that would be imposed upon them during an event like a hurricane strong enough to down a cargo vessel. So they had inadequate life rafts. They had inadequate survival suits. The survival suits that they were given are these they're orange. They cover you from, stem to stern with just your face open. Some of them have gloves, some of them don't. And they're supposed to be able to protect your body temperature to keep you from getting hypothermia when you go into the sea. They're also supposed to assist in flotation, but most of the time you also need to have a life vest. And one of the things that really bothered investigators when they listened to the transcript was the fact that Danielle Randolph left the bridge to go get her life vest.
I was thinking about that. Why didn't they have life vests on the bridge?
Right. Because that is protocol. You're supposed to have, your safety equipment and your life vest readily accessible to you. And for some reason, theirs weren't. I don't know where they were. I don't know if they were in the captain's stateroom. I don't know if they were in storage in hallways someplace. But for some reason, they weren't on the bridge. Which means I don't know if everyone else's were where they were supposed to be either. And when you look at the wreckage of the El Faro, you can actually see life rings still attached to where they were on the vessel, and you can see flotation equipment still attached. And there's wreckage around of a lifeboat that had been beat up and that sunk.
So they never salvaged, or they have not salvaged the El Faro yet.
They won't. She's 15,000 feet underwater.
I thought you said she was 15,000 feet. I just want to make sure that. And my question is, were the people on this boat, did they not have enough time to get out because of the weather and the equipment they were given to survive on? Did she sink that fast?
So from the time that they were given the order to abandon ship to the time that she sank, I think was somewhere around 8 minutes. So I don't think that they were given the opportunity. But even if they had, as we discussed earlier, this is a Category 4 hurricane.
Yeah, and they were so poorly equipped with what they needed to survive. I mean, the decision was made long before that took these people's lives. There was no saving them.
I mean, outside of giving them all jetpacks that don't exist yet to fly off this vessel, aside from avoiding this storm, I don't think anything else could have saved their lives. Because even if they had gotten off this ship in a Category 4 hurricane with
the swells
with swells of 85 feet high, there's no chance. We're not designed for that. They, according to the NTSB report, they all drowned.
Well,
that's without knowing.
Yeah, I mean, it is well known that the human body, when it strikes water versus striking pavement, it's going to be far more devastated by striking water than it will be striking pavement. And that there's I can't remember what year that study came out, but there was a study about it and how the impact of water and how it functions. So can you even imagine a swell coming down on someone like that? I mean, if none of y'all have seen Master and Commander, y'all need to watch Master and Commander.
Super good movie. Great book series, but good movie.
By Patrick O'Brien. Great, just great in general. But there's a scene in the movie where one of the characters gets swept into the water, and the water getting piled on top of them and whatnot. If you can't even... A life vest, a raft is not going to save these people.
No. Well, and the thing about water that's different from pavement is that water conforms to the vessel it's in. So water has motion, and pavement doesn't. I mean, it does, but not to the extent that water does. So when you hit pavement, you move, the pavement doesn't. But when water hits you, both you and the water moves. So there's a different level of force.
It's like two cars coming together. When one car's still going,
they both
have
speed.
Going. Yep.
Right. Exactly. So
it's a combined force.
Yeah, and it still tears your body in more directions than the one you were moving in. So, but in their case, I'm sure that they all drowned before they would have succumbed to any sort of traumatic injuries.
Yeah.
To begin with, and at the end of all of this, the El Faro sinking being what it was would actually lead to many ships being pulled from duty, and also a really hard look at Tote's operating procedures, as well as the hotly contested Jones Act. And there's a bunch that I could talk about, regarding all of this, but I'm not going to for now. We can cover it again in another episode. But Tote had ships pulled, and they've got new ships now. But both the El Faro's sister ships have been pulled from duty, the El Moro and the El Yunque. And the newer vessels that they run are from 2018, and they have a newer one that's coming out. So, they're not in... I think the oldest ship that they run now is from 1988.
So, basically, the deaths of these people potentially saved hundreds of more.
At least in this country.
Yeah. So, wow. That was absolutely terrifying and tragic. And I will definitely look more into it. And we are going to post links for the photos of the El Faro, so y'all can get an idea of what she looked like prior to her sinking, and then what she looked like after her sinking, just to give you a glimpse of how absolutely mortifying these types of things are. So I think Raquel and I need to quickly explain why we are so fascinated with maritime disasters. And part of that comes from the fact that we are absolutely terrified of maritime disasters. We are terrified of them. We are fascinated with them and terrified, and I think it's because we like to torture ourselves.
Yeah, we're terrified of water.
Yeah, there's this phobia called thalassophobia, and it is contributed.
A lot of you have it, you just don't know it.
You just don't know it. It is contributed, a lot of people say, to things in the water such as sea creatures. But people also negate to realize that it is also items in the water. Raquel and I could care less about whales and sharks and things like that in the water. What scares us is a stick. A stick sticking up out of the water absolutely will take us down.
I'm almost more terrified of it when it's half sticking out of the water than when it's fully under it. But then again, no.
No, it's the same thing. Like, you should see us. I wish that we could record ourselves going kayaking.
Well, I don't.
Because when we've kayaked in the past, it has been... We have done...
Oh, God, I can't think about it.
We have done our best, and it was... I remember this one time we were out on a lake, and we were okay in the middle. We were okay in the middle of it when you weren't near any sticks or trees. You didn't think
You knew in your head
you knew
that you were above a sunken school bus or something.
There was some kind of ship where you were just waiting to see the mast of something. Now, we're in the middle of a man-made lake, but
I know the light coming up from underneath.
There was going to be a mast, and there was obviously no mast. But
we wouldn't do well with Old Man of the Lake at Crater Lake.
No, that thing. So y'all need to look that up. If it's a big pillar thing, that it's a big log, they believe.
It's a log.
It's a log that's vertical and it floats around. It's been there for
100 years, 125 years.
100 something years. But anyway, we were at the lake and we were okay in the middle. We just couldn't look down. We just had to keep looking ahead, talking to each other. It's all good. But we have to make it to shore, right? Because, you can't live on the lake. Not in a kayak. You got to get food sometime. You can't just hover in and drop it down to you. So,
especially us. We got to get food.
Yeah, we made it out into the water, so obviously we can make it back. Well, the wind was blowing a little too hard, and we kept getting shifted towards the outside of the beach. And Raquel's like, and I'm like, oh my God, because there's grass and stuff growing up out of the water. I got
tears in my eyes right now.
Yeah, there's grass stuff growing out of the water, and there's there's broken off trees and tree branches, and it took us a while. And that's something that we are not afraid of many things, but thalassophobia, we absolutely have it. Just thinking about buoys and lakes that hold boats. Yeah, we can't do it. But whale sharks, I love whale sharks. I'd swim with whale sharks.
I got a tattoo of an octopus.
I have a tattoo of a whale shark and a shark. Yep. But not of boats and sticks and buoys and rocks. And if it's in the water, nope. And even if a boat is dry docked, there's not as much fear to it, but if it is in the water,
I know where it's been.
Yeah, if it's in the water at all, if it's half out of the water and half in the water, on land or what, nope, can't do it. No. There's just some psychological block there.
Yeah, but I want to look at all the sonar images from that lake.
Yep, we want to see everything. We want to see other people do it. And it's I thought about it. If I actually stuck my hand in water to touch something, like a boat, like the hull of a boat, could I do it? Not barehanded. You put a glove on me, I might be able to do it. But still probably not.
Yeah, that's our total irrational fear.
100%. Totally irrational. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. We've never had any traumatic experiences. We
none.
Grew up.
Although you did step on that metal piece of wire at White Lake when we were a kid.
I wonder if that has something to do with it. I was already terrified of the stuff inside moss anyway. There was always this moss at the bottom of White Lake where we learned to swim. But we'd go swim under the pier and whatnot. We had no problem with that. But we were walking one day and I stepped on there was a piece of old, metal fencing. Yep. And I stepped on it and damn near got tetanus.
You can't get tetanus from anything in the water.
It was. They
were worried about the tetanus from afterwards.
I said I almost got it. So it was not much fun, but I don't think that's really, because what really sticks out in both of our minds is the buoys.
Yeah,
the buoys that they used to have, the anchor buoys with the chains and then the balls at the top that would hold the boats in place and the skiffs and stuff. We could never go near those, regardless of us being able to touch piers and swim at the deep end and everything. Swim under piers. We would do everything to avoid.
Yeah. And it's not like we ever saw Jaws or anything. We'd never seen anything like that. We'd never seen, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or anything that would make it where we would be the way that we are. But, that's what phobias are. They're entirely irrational. And at the end of the day, we could still talk again for hours about our favorite shipwrecks.
We love looking at them. We love reading about them. And it's not because of the death and the gore. I mean, nobody could have died on it. It doesn't matter. It's just they're fascinating. And the mechanics behind them and the destruction of them is just incredible.
Yeah, we will actually be covering, I think half of our series is maritime disasters.
Yeah, because it's something it's not readily talked about.
And it is a deep passion of ours.
Very much so. Yeah. More so than serial killers.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
So I did want to mention that there is a memorial for the El Faro crew in San Juan. It is shaped like a lighthouse.
Makes sense.
It does. And it honors all of those people that were lost on October 1st, 2015.
Wow.
So, yep. As you all know, we do a Pearl of Wisdom at the end of every episode. A little something that sometimes might relate to the episode and sometimes might not, but something that we have learned over the years or heard that we think that everyone should be aware of. And today's Pearl of Wisdom is about escaping when you're confused and underwater. It's really easy when you get underwater to lose orientation, particularly if it's dark, even if it's not. So you just have to remember that bubbles always go upwards towards the surface. And if you can see them, follow them. And if you can't see them, try and reach out to grab one and feel where it's at. And that way you'll know which direction is up. Because many times people that are drowning will swim downward thinking they're going upwards.
Yep.
That is all for today.
All right. That's it. Tune in to us next time.
Today's episode was written by Raquel Weiss, sound editing and mixing by Raven Hutto. Our theme song was composed by Steve Brenly. Today's sources can be found on our Facebook and Instagram page at Twins Discuss Podcast. The Twins will be back next week with an all-new episode.